This is the 4.4 summary video. If you haven't already, please go and watch the longer 4.4 video that's also linked online. This unit is mainly about the populist. In the last few units, we've talked about how big businesses have grown in the late 19th century. Farmers and workers ended up forming political organizations so you get more political power and create a better economic well-being for themselves, since they were struggling pretty bad, farmers with low prices and then workers with low pay. The problem for farmers is that as mechanized farming increased and technology increased, that led to higher productivity. As they produced more, that created a higher supply. And as they create a higher supply, that means prices fell, which is called deflation. And so since prices were falling, they thought it would be a good idea to grow more. Well, that made prices fall even further. Supply exceeded demand and prices fell. At first, farmers responded to their falling prices by producing more, which is only going to make the problem worse because that made their supply go up even higher. Then they're going to blame the railroads. And so they're going to say that since the railroads have a monopoly, that the railroads kept charging more and more money, that the railroads are to blame because they keep charging them so much to ship their goods. And they have to pay the railroads because there's no other way they could sell their goods. To try to fix their problems, they started participating in organizations like the Grange, which at first was an educational movement and a social movement for farmers, but eventually they elected Grangers to office. In the western and southern states, there were a few Grangers that were elected to the state legislatures, and in the state legislatures they tried to regulate how much railroads could charge by setting a limit that only railroads could charge a certain amount. That was supposed to help farmers since the railroads had a monopoly. A problem occurred when the Supreme Court said that the state legislatures could not regulate trade across state lines since it was interstate trade. That would fall under the responsibilities of the U.S. Congress. Well, so the U.S. Congress then passed the Interstate Commerce Act to regulate railroads. This was a big deal because it was the first time the government ever regulated a big business. However, again, the Supreme Court, through the freight rate cases, limited the effectiveness of the law. Farmers were still looking for a solution to their problem, so they started forming the Populist Party, which is known as the People's Party, and it was formed to influence the national government. They wanted to regulate the railroads and banks. They wanted to introduce free and unlimited coinage of silver, and that would cause inflation, which would help prices go up, and so then they would be able to pay off their loans more easily. They wanted a direct election of senators, the secret ballot, and a graduated income tax, all of which we eventually get. They also attempt to ally with workers by pushing for an 8-hour workday. This is meant to get workers on their side. The Populist Party has had a profound effect on American politics. They were very successful at electing governors, senators, and state legislatures in the South and West. However, they never won a big office like the presidency. Eventually, though, the Democrats are going to take a lot of their reforms, and a lot of their reforms are end up passing, like the direct election of senators, like the 8-hour workday, like the graduated income tax, and secret ballot. Now I'm going to move from one group that struggled to another group that struggled. The group we're talking about now are workers. The conditions in the factories were very bad. There were long hours, low wages, and bad conditions. The factory owners would not pay to have the conditions improved because that would cost too much money. There were so many workers out there that business owners didn't have to pay workers a lot. If workers didn't like it, then oh well, they could just hire someone else to take that job. That's the whole idea behind supply and demand. There were also a lot of immigrants looking for work along with former farmers. This is going to drive down pay and cause workers to be viewed as just replaceable cogs in the machine. The management of these businesses, they're going to increasingly treat workers as being replaceable. As a result, workers start to join labor unions to help protect themselves because there's power in numbers. They advocated for arbitration. They really didn't want to go on strike. However, management's going to be real hostile towards the unions. They're going to use African Americans and recent immigrants as scabs to break up strikes, which is going to cause growing tension between white workers and those two groups. They're also going to use private security forces to break up the strikes. The government is also going to support the management of these big businesses over the workers, and they're going to use the Army to help break up strikes. They use the Sherman Antitrust Act against unions, even though it was originally designed to stop monopolies and help workers. The public thought that labor unions were socialist, anarchist, violent, and radical, and they really did not support the unions, and that was because of a few strikes that occurred that were violent, but the overall impression of unions is that they are violent and radical. The one group that had some success in organizing in labor unions were skilled workers, and that's because they were harder to replace because they had a specific skill. Overall, however, unions have very little success and were generally seen as being radical and bad. The government always also did not help the workers. The election of 1896 was seen as a pivotal one in American history. You had a populist, William Jennings Bryan, who was running as a Democrat. He was running against a Republican, William McKinley. And in this you have a really big debate between soft money and hard money, which we'll probably discuss a lot more in class. What soft money meant would be higher inflation, which would help workers. Hard money would be money backed by gold. In the end, William McKinley wins, but Theodore Roosevelt becomes his vice president. And when William McKinley is assassinated, that's going to lead to Theodore Roosevelt becoming president, and he is the most progressive president we had up to that point. In summary, both workers and farmers struggled in this time period. Workers because of low wages and bad conditions, and then farmers because of falling prices. They couldn't pay back their mortgage and then they lost their land. This is going to cause a lot of problems, so the populists are going to try to address those problems, and labor unions are going to try to address those problems. Neither group has a ton of success. However, a lot of those reforms that the populists want to make are eventually implemented. That concludes section 4.4. Please go watch the longer video if you haven't already, and go to Edmodo to turn in your notes guide and take the video quiz.